Evangelicals have been trying hard to be all things to all men for at least 2 or 3 generations, and in this regard, they've absolutely succeeded at that. The evangelical movement is now so broad and so diverse that you can define it practically any way you want. And in fact, a couple of years ago, Christianity Today did a series of introductory articles for their 50th anniversary edition, and they said they think diversity is actually the dominant feature of evangelicalism. And that's probably true if you are talking about the contemporary evangelical movement. If we can discern the contours of the evangelical movement by looking at the constituency of Christianity today, and I think it would be fair to say it's one of the largest mixed multitudes ever known in the realm of human religion, the evangelical movement. It's just a massive mixed multitude, and that is not a compliment. It's not a good thing. You'll find that expression, mixed multitude, 3 times in the King James Version of the Bible, and each time it's used as a disparaging expression to describe the backslidden, spiritually eclectic, morally compromised majority of Israelites during those times of their worst apostasies. A mixed multitude. Now, I know this is not a popular opinion, and in all likelihood, some of you right here in this room will disagree with me when I say what I'm about to say, but in my assessment, we are living in a time of apostasy that really isn't all that different from some of the eras described in the Old Testament where the worship of Jehovah was so compromised that good men, including Elijah, sometimes wondered if there were any knees left that hadn't bowed to Baal. There you go. I'm already starting to sound pretty negative, despite everyone's best efforts to keep me positive. So let me say it this way. I'm positive that the broad evangelical movement I'm positive that this movement is abominable. The brand of Christianity, or should I say the assorted brands of Christianity that are represented by Christianity Today and the National Association of Evangelicals and the Christian Coalition and, the spiritual heirs of Billy Graham and Fuller Seminary and the Urbana conferences, this large movement that most of our spiritual parents identified with, that whole movement, that vast movement, is now as utterly backslidden and spiritually degenerate as Israel was in the most backslidden state during those times of apostasy that are described in the book of Judges. In fact, we have reached the point where everyone does what is right in his own eyes. And lots of so-called evangelicals think that's just fine. The current editors of Christianity Today seem to think that's just fine. They never tire of celebrating their constituency's diversity. And I frankly don't like to identify with the contemporary evangelical movement. I'm strongly tempted simply to stop calling myself an evangelical altogether, just to keep from being associated with every infamous religious scoundrel from Ted Haggard to Joel Osteen, because they all say they're evangelical. So what does it actually mean to say we are evangelical when the menagerie of heretics and charlatans that appear every night on TBN all insist that they are evangelical too? Tony Campolo, who has renounced practically everything that's distinctively evangelical, insists on calling himself an evangelical. Lots of Roman Catholics consider themselves evangelical, and lately even Mormons have begun arguing that they have a right to that label too. None of them would agree on what the term means, but they all want to wear it because it gives them an artificial connection with the rich heritage of evangelical history. And that is exactly the problem for me. That's why I'm not quite ready to relinquish the term yet. I do affirm historic evangelical principles. The original evangelicals are my spiritual ancestors. I believe what they believed. I'm passionate about what they were passionate about. We share a common faith. And I happen to believe it is the same faith proclaimed by the apostles in the early church. But in the broad sweep of church history, the set of convictions that is best known by the name evangelicalism is just about to die out. I'm not ready to concede that label to people who have no spiritual connection and, frankly, nothing whatsoever in common with historic evangelical beliefs. Incidentally, there are some who would try to tell you that everything that's wrong with the evangelical movement today is actually rooted in that original set of beliefs that gave birth to evangelicalism. The Pope would head the list of those who want to make that argument. He'd say that evangelicalism today is diverse and doctrinally chaotic precisely because the original Protestant evangelicals departed from the magisterium of Rome. And he'd say that without an infallible interpreter of Scripture, without a bishop who can speak with absolute ex cathedra authority, it was predictable that evangelicalism would eventually disintegrate into a jumble of contradictory teachings. That is the Catholic argument. And for whatever reasons, a lot of erstwhile evangelicals found that argument compelling. A couple of years ago, Francis Beckwith, who was at the time president of the Evangelical Theological Society, announced that he was converting or deconverting to Roman Catholicism, and this was one of his arguments. He had concluded that evangelicalism lacks any compelling tradition. And in fact, looking at evangelicalism in the big picture of church history, he decided that evangelicalism was an anomaly and a dangerous set of ideas to boot. And so he abandoned evangelical principles for Roman Catholicism. Oddly enough, that didn't keep Francis Beckwith from continuing to insist that he in fact still was entitled to call himself evangelical. And he originally seemed to think there was no reason why he shouldn't be able to retain his post as president of the Evangelical Theological Society. And I've been amazed and frankly appalled over the past decade or so to see the number of young men who are following a similar path to Francis Beckwith. They are rightly fed up with the superficiality and the doctrinal confusion that dominates the modern and postmodern evangelical movement, but they have wrongly concluded that evangelical principles are to blame. And so they abandon evangelicalism altogether, not just the evangelical movement, which frankly deserves to be abandoned, but they also abandon the core beliefs of historic evangelical conviction. And some of them, like Beckwith, run to Rome. Others, like Frankie Schaeffer and Peter Gilchrist, have gone to Eastern Orthodoxy. Many more have run after various strains of the emerging church movement, buying the lie that because emerging churches burn candles and talk about contemplative spirituality, they somehow have a stronger tie to historic Christianity than their parents had in their seeker-sensitive churches, where the only liturgy they knew was trivial choruses led by bad rock bands and sermons based on references to pop culture. And you can't blame them for thinking that way, because there is some truth in their contempt for that shallow superficiality. Frankly, the liturgy of the average emergent gathering is 10 times worse than their parents' shallow stuff, but still, lots of young people are abandoning evangelical principles, evangelical beliefs, because they think those beliefs are what made the evangelical movement today as wacky and as embarrassing as it is. Now, I'm convinced that the evangelical movement went astray not because they followed historic evangelical principles, but because they abandoned them. And frankly, contemporary evangelicalism, and I'm talking about the movement here, the movement has no right to the label evangelical. For the most part, the evangelical movement is not evangelical at all. and it hasn't been since sometime after the